All right, guys, today's video's got a little bit of a hot take in it. And today we're going to talk about how Hollywood does not know how to write heroes anymore. They've learned how to deconstruct them. They learned how to diminish them. They know how to explain why they're flawed, but they don't seem to know how to celebrate what made heroes in the first place. It felt like Luke Skywalker. And after watching Masters of the Universe, I think they just did it to He-Man too. Let's head into the film room. All right, guys, welcome into the film room. And today we're going to look at one that I was really excited to see, and that was Masters of the Universe. And after sitting with this movie for a couple of hours, which really kind of felt like it was 15 to 20 minutes, maybe too long, I think I've really figured out what bothered me. If you saw my out of theater review, you saw where I felt like I said, our childhood has ended, and I don't feel any different the next way. You know, it wasn't the visuals, it wasn't the action, it wasn't even some of the story decisions. I mean, it was the way the movie seemed to view He-Man himself that kind of bothered me. Let me start with this though. I mean, I didn't hate the movie. In fact, there were parts I genuinely enjoyed. I mean, the Eternia looked fantastic. I mean, it just was everything that I thought a modern day He-Man would look like. I mean, other than the fact that they got like Castle Grayskull in the back of the castle, the Eternia proper. So, they kind of take that mysterious part where, He-Man goes through the woods and all of a sudden, he kind of bat caves to the great, the Castle Grayskull, like in the cartoons. And if you haven't figured out, I'm sorry, guys, there's going to be some spoilers in this. So if you haven't seen the movie yet and you don't want to hear any spoilers, I'll try to kind of tell you if I'm going to spoil something. The action sequences are entertaining. The cast kind of does a solid job, and then there are moments when you can see that the movie could have been super, super amazing. I mean, it could have been the foundation for a really good franchise. But the more and more I watched it, the more and more I started thinking about something else from our childhood, and that's kind of Star Wars. More specifically Luke Skywalker. For generations, Luke Skywalker represented hope, he represented courage, he had that belief that ordinary people could rise to extraordinary challenges. He-Man was very similar to people our age in the 80s. It wasn't just the strength of the character, but it was leadership, confidence, responsibility. He-Man showed up, things were going to be okay. He was always going to stand up for what's right, and when other people didn't. And that's why when you were a little kid, you wanted to be Luke Skywalker. You wanted to be He-Man. Not because he was the strongest man on Eternia, but because he stood for something. And that's where I think this movie misses the mark. Instead of showing us why He-Man became a hero, the film spends much of the time pulling him apart, questioning him, reducing him, having other characters push him towards becoming who he's supposed to be. And I kind of felt that in the very beginning. I saw where this was going to go, when they have Adam on Earth, and that's kind of a spoiler too. The first thing they do is they put him in a yellow Subaru. And I said, okay, here we go. At times it felt like the movie was more interested in deconstructing He-Man than really celebrating him. And that's become a trend in a lot of modern franchises. Instead of introducing new generations to the heroes that inspired millions of us as kids, we keep getting stories that feel determined to explain why those heroes weren't great as we thought. I don't think that's what the fans were looking for in this movie. I think everybody our age especially are going to go in there thinking this is going to be some fantastic franchise. It looks great. The trailers were good. Like I said, the movie itself is beautiful. But when I go to see Masters of the Universe, I want to see He-Man, the hero, the leader, the champion of Eternia, not a character who spends most of the movie trying to figure out whether he's worthy of being things. Then there's Skeletor, one of the most iconic villains in animation history. The rivalry between He-Man and Skeletor is the foundation of the franchise. And here comes another spoiler, but by the end of the movie, that rivalry is gone. They kill him off. He-Man wins. There's no He-Man 2. I mean, you could have had, 3 or 4 or 5 movies, that would have been awesome if they would have, handled this together. But they were ready to squash him at the very end, get rid of one of the most iconic villains ever. I mean, and then there's a post-credit scene, which is also a spoiler, that points immediately to She-Ra. Okay. And, let's be clear, this isn't a criticism of She-Ra. I mean, I get it. I understand why people like She-Ra, but it left me questioning, is this supposed to be the launch of a Masters of the Universe franchise? Or why does it feel like the movie is already looking past He-Man? Because by the time the post credits rolled, I was thinking about the future of He-Man. I wasn't thinking about that. I was like, okay, are we going to do something? What are they going to show in the post credit? And then bang, here she comes, and I'm like, oh, they've already killed him off. I'm thinking, okay, is He-Man going to be a supporting character in his own franchise? And that's disappointing because the pieces were all there. The world building was there. The visuals were there. The mythology was there. I thought Idris Elba was great as Man at Arms. They showed him become a flawed character, like trying to recover from his failure. Then he comes back and he's a hero in the end. I thought that was great. The action was there. The movie had everything it needed to become something special. Instead, it feels like a team loaded with talent that never embraced its identity. And as a coach, I can tell you that's one of the most frustrating things to watch. You can see the potential, you can see what it could have been, but you never quite get there. So, that's kind of my final score. For me, Master Universe is a field goal. They settled for points instead of going for the end zone. And it wasn't because the movie was bad, but because it had all the ingredients to be a touchdown. And it just settled for something less. And, like I said, for somebody my age, I kind of feel like, my childhood, He-Man was that guy. Luke Skywalker was that guy. But I left this movie with the same feeling I did after I watched Last Jedi, just shaking my head saying, man, you guys had something great in your hands. You could have did something amazing with this movie. And yet you chose to take it to a different direction. And so that's why my final score is a field goal. Now I kind of want to hear from you. What's your final score? Touchdown, field goal, Hail Mary, safety, 3 and out? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.